right, well, we're going to get started. My name is Lily DePino, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad you're here. And I'm going to be talking today mostly about choral counting, although we will talk about counting collections as well, and how those two practices can be used for all learners, but also how they fit into different parts of an all learners lesson. So we are going to be talking about choral counting. So the plan for our time together is definitely to sort of define what choral counting is and can be, and counting collections as well. Hopefully there'll be a little bit of time right before we end where you can explore some of the tools and sample resources, and maybe even share some ideas about how you might use or how you're using choral counting and counting collections in your practice. So don't hit enter just yet on the chat, but just in the chat, think about whether or not you did some counting today and when you did it and why you did it, and just jot some ideas into the chat. And then when I say go, we can enter those in. So did you count today at all, and why? And if you're ready, you can go ahead and enter that into the chat. Oh my goodness. So, oh gosh, birds, holiday cards, time, how many more minutes, yoga stretches, scoops of formula, Amazon packages, counting attendance. Yep, math in the math problem during the last session. Yeah, counting cookies. Nice, counting minutes. How many things in this schedule? Yeah, so this is something I love to do with children too, and asking them about when and how they counted, because I think sometimes counting doesn't get the credit that it's due. And I love pointing out to both adults and children all the times in the day when we use counting to figure things out and solve problems. A little backstory on me. I was a kindergarten teacher for many years. I'm now a district math coach, and I'm working with children in grades K-8. And I will say that working with upper elementary and middle school is somewhat terrifying, but every time I go and work with them, I'm astounded at the number of times and number of ways that they're using counting to solve problems. And they're doing it almost as a sort of like under the table. They don't want anyone to know they're counting. And I try to really encourage them to, no, use counting. How are you using counting to solve this problem? Before I was in between being a kindergarten teacher, I also worked as an academic support teacher, and I was often asked to assess students, and older students who were struggling, and often the struggle was thought to be place value, and in fact there were place value misconceptions and struggles. But really I began to notice a pattern, and is that children who struggled with math really struggled to make sense of counting, and in particular counting backwards. And so I really wanted to do some deep thinking about counting and really consider ways in the school that I was working in at the time about how we could sort of reframe our mindset around counting and start differently. We were doing lots of counting. We were doing sparkle counting, counting around the circle, and all the counting was sort of at a surface level. And it was great for some kids, and some kids were really benefiting from it, but there was always this pod of students that just struggled to make those decade transitions, struggled, would say, 209, 300, or 99, 1,000, or the teen numbers were just always a hot mess for a lot of kids at a lot of different grade levels. And so I was really curious about ways to support students in counting. And I was personally struggling with how to do that until I came across the book choral counting and counting collections. And I remember the first time I read about recording the count, writing the count down as we were counting, I thought, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. Why haven't we been doing that? I'm probably guilty of talking about counting too much, but counting is where everything starts, and we count all day long. We're always using counting, even as adults. I think about the number of times I see adults counting, how many more minutes, how many more hours we're using our fingers, counting how many miles over the speed limit was I traveling when I passed that state trooper. Yeah, so the benefits and the importance of counting cannot be overstated. Steve Linewine and Patsy Cantor talk about it in their book, Developing Numerical Fluency, Making Numbers, Facts, and Competition Meaningful. And it was so validating when I read that. And so before we go on, sorry, I'm getting my nerves to settle down a little bit. I'm so comfortable talking to small children and not always so comfortable talking to a large group of adults, so you'll be patient with me. I'm gonna have us go into breakout rooms a little bit, or in a little bit rather, to talk about what it is that children are, thank you, what it is that children are doing and noticing and learning when they're counting. I scrabbled a little bit in planning this today around talking a lot about early counting and but I bet and defining that, but you all are experts in what counting looks like at your grade level with your students. And so I thought we'd do a little bit of sharing out about what you're noticing students are doing and noticing and learning when they're counting, whether they be students in your class or even your own children. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that as a sort of laying the foundation for then talking about how choral counting can support all learners. The question was, what are children doing, noticing, and learning when they're counting? And what grade do you teach or work with?
Right now, I'm the literacy teacher, but right now I work with K-1 in math. Mm-hmm. And I taught primary for quite a long time, so I have a lot of experience with math. So what was your question again?
It's just, what are children doing? What are they learning? What are they noticing when they're counting? Or why do they count? Like, what's the importance of having them? Why should we have them count?
I suppose it depends on how they're counting. If it's just an oral counting, that's one thing. If it's counting items, that's something different. Right. Sometimes it's just learning the pattern of how numbers, if you're oral counting, just learning the names of the numbers and the order they go in, versus learning the value of numbers. Or I think it depends, I guess, on what the activity is you're doing with them, what they learn from it.
Right. Do you have students do choral counting or counting collections now that you're working with?
We count collection. We'll count items. We don't probably choral count because it's just the two of us. We may do a count. Like sometimes I have to go outside to get kids back to my room, because we can't go in. So we might count, like I may say 13, she says 14. We may go back and forth and do that because it's something we can do while we're walking, those kind of things. They do it in the classroom during those games, like, someone pops down if you're 10, every time you get to 10, or those, kind of things. So we do some of that.
Great observations, great noticing. Does anybody want to share a little bit about what was said in their group?
We were talking about some of the unusual things that kids do when they count.
Yeah.
Like 1, 2, 3, 6. Why 6? Also, how sometimes they run out of steam. They'll be counting objects just fine, and then they're like, and then you get the 1, 2, 3, 6 thing.
Yeah.
It's almost like they stop paying attention to where they are in the sequence.
Mm-hmm. Or you ever had that phenomenon where they get to 7 and it's the first number that's 2 syllables, and so they double tag? Yep. One, two, and they're tagging 1 to 1, and then they get to 7 and they double tag. Yeah.
Or they
It gets
combine
so
13 and 14 together?
Yeah, 13. Yep. And you'll get some 30s and 30s as well. Yep. Well, these are some, 15 and 13. Ooh.
Switching between teens and T's?
Yes, teens and T numbers. Yep. All of those areas of, the English language is just a disaster for learning to count, because they get the 1 to 9 sequence and 10, and then you come to 11 and 12, which I've had some very indignant and rightfully so 5-year-olds say to me, well, why isn't that 1 teen or 2 teen? And I'd say, you know what? I wish you were in charge of inventing the names of numbers. Or even 13, 3 teen, 15, 5 teen. And then so they struggle to make sense of those teen numbers, and then they've got to make that. And it isn't really until they've transitioned successfully from the teen numbers through the 20s into the 30s where the pattern starts to really predictably repeat itself. And we know that so many kids, especially our younger learners, but this happens in a lot of different places, get to 29 and they'll say, that's it, that's what I know. Or I was working with some 5th graders the other day that would get to 109 or 209 or whatever the century was that we were in, and then they would just immediately go to the next century. So counting is tricky.
In certain kids, they would get up to, but I'm not 7, I'm 4. So they were confused about just that the number names could have different meanings in the groupings, and they're getting better now. Obviously, we're in December, but I found that interesting too. Well,
yeah, right. And it can be so interesting too after students have counted a quantity of something and you ask them, so how many did you have? And they've got to recount, right? Because they haven't conserved, they don't understand the cardinality of what they've just done. So cardinality being like being able to say how many. So there are lots of routines and practices that we do to practice counting. There's count around the circle, there's sparkle count. And like I was saying before, a lot of those really sort of exist in what we might, in terms, if you're just talking sort of like Hattie-esque language, John Hattie's work in learning. So kids came along, they've got the pattern, sometimes it's rhythmic. Oh, I saw a kid, sorry, just a little tangent, who was snapping to help himself figure out what came next yesterday. I thought that was so interesting. And then he would pound on the table as he was going. So there are lots of sort of sing-songy, there's counting songs, there's all kinds of things. And those practices, there's nothing wrong with those. But what I started to notice in my work was that kids who could count successfully did fine, and kids who struggled always struggled with those routines. And they lost track, or they weren't sure, and often they were put on the spot. And as much as I love counting and learning about counting, I also am fascinated about how we can make our classrooms inclusive and not alienating. And I didn't feel good when a student struggled to figure out what came next in the count around the circle routine. And so those are some of the reasons why I moved away from those kinds of counting practices to choral counting specifically. And there are a couple of reasons why. There are many reasons, but in particular, that choral counting is publicly recorded and we all count together with one voice. And this, at first, when I first read that, I will say, when I first got this book, I thought choral counting, oh my goodness, we spent so many years not doing choral reading, and that word choral is really loaded in elementary education. But I tried it out, and I was with like 4 numbers into the first choral count, I was hooked. Because there's that piece for me as a teacher of really interesting opportunity as we're counting to collect formative assessment about the kinds of mistakes we're making individually as a group. Now, I might not always know who said what, but I can hear when a miscount is made. And oftentimes when I was doing this with kindergartners and first graders, it was a handful of kiddos making a miscount. And so I knew, okay, that's something we need to work on. So I was getting a lot of formative assessment, but there was also that place, John, I think this is you this morning that talked about relaxed curiosity. Choral counting was this, like, everybody loved it. When I said we were going to count around the circle, it was like, oh. But when I said, okay, we're going to do a choral count, I'm going to record it and we're going to look for patterns, everybody was on board. And I didn't realize until today that was sort of the change in the culture and the mindset in our room, where I didn't realize that I had a name for that. And it really was like, there wasn't this pressure that students were under, and everybody was engaged in the exercise of counting. So these features of choral counting are right from choral counting and counting class. There's a link right down here to the book. But I think what's really important about choral counting is that as teachers, we take a little time to sort of think ahead and pre-plan the count. So it's a little bit different than say, okay, someone give me a number and we're going to start from that number and we're all going to count. And there's a place for that kind of counting as well. But a choral count is really specific. So, in this example over here, I had a group of second graders that really struggled to count by twos, and they were rote counting by twos, and then they'd kind of get to 16 and just sort of fall off, and maybe they'd say 17 or 19, and they didn't have an understanding of really what they were doing. And so we counted together. We practiced counting in one voice. I thought that was going to take a while for them to be able to do it, because some kids might faster, but they got it right away. We practiced by saying the vowels together, and that was our routine. And then we went right into counting. And that support of counting together in one voice means that if you make a mistake, it's okay, because someone else in the group is there counting the correct number in the sequence. And it's not, we just keep going, or sometimes we stop and say, oh, did you notice we need to fix something? And then we can back up a little bit, but there's that support of the people around you. And then a choral count should count far enough so that you can see some patterns and some regularities in the sequence. Sometimes a choral count gets embedded or connected with also a visual representation, and I have some ideas and I'll share those with you a little bit later on about how you can incorporate those as well. But I thought we would do a choral count together. So some of the strategies that I've used in a remote setting, because everybody's internet is working a little bit differently, is the recommendation is to have students mute themselves but count along with you. So it's a little bit different than in the classroom, because you don't have the whole group necessarily counting together, but you do have the teacher's voice. And then the other recommendation is to kind of check in a little bit more frequently than you might, because you're not able to hear students. We're going to count by sevens today. And I can tell you that one of the ways that you can plan ahead for a count like this is using this tool from Stenhouse Publishers. You do have to register and make an account, but it's totally free. And you can kind of play around with how you're going to count. You can play around with what you're going to count by. You can play around a little bit with how the count is going to be organized, and so on and so forth. So there's a link to this in the slideshow, but this is what I would do to count. And then usually I also go through and start to look and see what kinds of patterns I notice. Okay, is everybody ready? All right, so we're gonna count by seven. We're gonna start at 7 and we're gonna work our way across. So 7, 14, 21, 35. I lost my thing. Whoops. And I always tell the kids, make sure that I'm typing what you're saying, because sometimes it's tricky. All right, let's keep going. 49.
Skip 28.
Yep. 29, 56. Oh, did I forget a number? Nope, I did. Yeah, I did. I forgot 28. Thank you. That's what you're telling me. It's also a really good idea not to chat while you're counting. There we go. We'll fix that later. 63, 70, 77. All right. 84, 91. Okay. Usually at this point, I would stop and ask the kiddos, what do you notice? What do you wonder about the count so far?
Yes, so I'm starting looking at the at 14. I think this is what my kids would say. There's 1 in 14, and then in 21 and 28 there's 2 twos, and then when you get to 35 there's only 1 3 in the 2-digit number, and it's going back, and it seems to be going back and forth, this pattern of in the tens place, the digit repeating.
Yeah, so here there are 2 twos, and then there's a 3, and then there's 2 4s, and then a 5, right?
Yeah, and then my mind is kind of blown because there's only 1 6, and I would have expected there to be 2 6s.
Right, yeah, something different, it happens here. Nice, and then it goes back to the pattern of 2 of the same digit, 1 of an 8, 2 9s, and then we have 10. Maybe we might talk about it that way. 10 10s, 11 10s, depends on where we're at. Yeah, interesting.
I noticed that as the columns go down, the number in the ones place remains the same.
Nice. So as the columns go down, the number in the ones place remains the same. So could we figure out then what the number in the ones place would be? Oopsie, that would, holy cow, that would go in this box right down here. Sorry, this box underneath 158.
Would it be 158 or 154?
It would be 154. Thank you. Actually, that's a mistake. So, oh goodness. It would be 154. Thank you. Could we figure out what would go in this box? I think you get the idea, right? So there's a lot of conversation around looking for patterns and thinking about why those patterns happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into breakout rooms. I've got some sample choral counts here. You can look at the same chart together, or you can talk about a different chart amongst yourselves. There's some different examples there, but really we're just thinking about what are those learners noticing during the choral count, and what are the kinds of questions that we could ask those students about what they're noticing, or about what they might do next, or what might come next in the chart. So this choral count routine is a little bit more intentional in some ways than just a count around. It gives lots of opportunity for conversation about structure in the number system, noticing what's happening with the patterns and why the patterns happen, whether you're working vertically or you're working horizontally. What are some things that people noticed? Which charts caught your attention?
Okay, we noticed about the counting, but we thought it was really cool how on slide 20, the students were counting by tens all the way up to 30 tens. And so they were really looking at what happens when you keep adding 10, or in the tens place and then in the hundreds place. And we wondered what the colors were for, and whether they were looking at the relationship between tens and hundreds.
Are you talking about this chart here, John?
Yeah, that one there.
Yeah. So the colors in some cases are like they indicate the same noticing, and sometimes the recording on the count gets so exciting that sometimes colors get a little bit duplicated. So for example, there were a lot of students that noticed the 3 in the ones place. These are first graders doing this count. And then the 33, the 123, the 333, these are 2 different noticings. The students were noticing that there were 33 ones here, but over here there were 33 ones, but then there was another 33 over here, and they weren't quite sure about that one. But it was when they got down here that they realized, oh, wait a minute, that's how many 10s are in the number. And then we went back and we looked. 1 10, 2 10s, 3 10s, and I stopped writing it, as you can see. Then we just started counting them. This one here, someone just noticed that that it's 1 2 3. So sometimes when you do these counts, it gets so exciting, and there's so many observations that that by the end of it, the chart is it's very chaotic. There's so much to go back and talk about again with students. Do you remember what we were noticing here? And sometimes even they won't remember, but they'll notice something different.
Well, in the very first slide, our group was talking about
this one.
Oh, great. How you started with 0. And we noticed that the learners were kind of seeing a diagonal, if that's what you were circling. Yeah. The numbers, and it kind of made a diagonal path there. But then we had a little discussion about starting with 0, and then like a number path that would go horizontally and all that.
Yeah, and I didn't actually we didn't start by saying 0. We just left that box empty and we started over here. In fact, I don't even think there was a box here when we started this count. There was just an empty space. And so I really wanted to, this was a group of kindergartners that was just beginning to fluent with those transitions, those end of decade transitions. And so I really wanted to honor that when we get to that 9, right, that something new is happening. So we set it up this way a little bit differently. And yes, we write the numbers as the kids are saying them. So this is what makes it a little bit different than, say, counting on a hundreds chart or something like that. They don't know what's coming next necessarily. And as you can see, as I did today, you make mistakes, but you can go back and fix those mistakes. I used to do it on chart paper like this. Now I project an empty table on a slide so that things aren't getting all squished to one side. So there's uniformity in the size of the columns and everything. And also so it just supports them in seeing patterns going horizontally or vertically as well as horizontally. So, and the reason for the boxes on this one was because I was grappling with that, where we'd be writing on a chart and we'd get all jammed up on the right hand side because of just the size of number. So that was one trick that was really helpful for me. I also just want to, before we move on to counting collections here a little bit, just give a little word of caution when counting backwards, especially with kindergartners or pre-Ks. Or anytime you're counting backwards with a new concept. So even counting backwards with unit fractions on a number line, and I have a little video in here a little bit further down where I talk about that, but I really recommend using adding machine tape for moving backwards and for working from the right, well, then probably backwards for you, but working right to left. So that it honors the structure of the number path that maybe is hanging up somewhere in your classroom or that students have access to. Once students are really comfortable moving backwards in the counting sequence, then you can work backwards left to right. But that's really confusing for students that are trying to make sense of how to move backwards, who don't yet have that sort of internalized number path, who aren't able to always know exactly what comes before and what comes after that one more, one less. So this is a way to support that. And then there's also the physicality of moving along the number path if you're able to do that, or the numbers moving if you're doing it in a virtual setting from right to left. And the first time I did this with kindergartners, I had them stand up and we moved right to left as we were counting too. And that was really helpful for some of them. Sometimes, especially working one-on-one student, or you just want to do something a little bit different with a choral count, it can be nice to use a different tool. I really like using this flip counter from ICT Games because you can count by tens, not starting at 10. So that's a really interesting tool. And it's also a really fun way to predict and think about one more, one less as sort of a pre-tool talk with the kids before going into maybe a larger choral count. And you can look at other patterns. You can work forwards. I've also used this when I'm working one-on-one with students. And it's, yeah, and it's a really lovely tool. And there are some different tools at ICT Games that would also work well for this kind of a slightly different take on a choral count. But again, we count together, we count out loud, and we stay together. This is using, this is one I did with some second graders the other day using a number rack. They had their number racks and we were counting and keeping track. So the piece that's really important is that students are seeing the numbers as they're saying them. So you can do that in some different ways. And I just want to put a plug in here for choral counting with unit fractions in particular. I had some third graders and some fourth graders I was working with who just were struggling with the idea that a fraction was a number. And when we put them on a number line and we counted by them, and then we also connected this like a area model or a pattern block model with it as well, it was that I had so many kids have aha moments like, oh, right, it's a number. And you know, I was really intentional about putting the 0 and the 1, and then we expanded it and we counted the numbers between 0 and 2, and we put an arrow up on the number path, the big one in the classroom. We said these numbers all live between 0 and 1, and the idea that there were more numbers on the number path than are shown was sort of mind-blowing, and they were really excited about that. So I've really encouraged teachers. There's a little bit further down, I put some links to some videos of teachers counting with fractions, and it's such a powerful tool, and it's a nice universal intervention. So everybody gets a little bit of something that they need, whether it's the actual counting of the unit fraction or if it's going back and looking at the structure. There's something for everybody. And then of course there's counting forwards and backwards. There's using counting by elapsed increments of elapsed time. And I know this always seems to come up with third graders, and they're just completely flummoxed by elapsed time. And so we tried to do some choral counting with that, and that it didn't fully untangle elapsed time for them, but it did give them a sense of, I think, of magnitude of time, which they were lacking. And then we were able to go back, and that's something that we had just sort of started playing around with, and then COVID hit. So that's something I would like to tinker with a little bit more. So we just have a few more minutes, and I wanted to give everybody a little bit of time. Oh, someone put in the chat about the hundreds chart, and I couldn't agree more about the hundreds chart. it's just really tricky. And I watched some students yesterday working with the hundreds chart, and they had done a fabulous job of proceduralizing the hundreds chart. And when we took the hundreds chart away and we had them, it was really apparent that they really didn't understand. Like, they'd figured out how to use the hundreds chart to get an answer, but they didn't really understand what their answer was. So the like choral counting can really also help sort of untangle the hundreds chart, especially if you play around with how you organize the hundreds chart. Okay, so the other really important, I think, again, universal piece that benefits everybody is counting collections. And I didn't say this before, but choral counting could be your lunch, it could be part of your main lesson, it could be part of a menu. And the same with counting collections. For at least for my purposes, they mostly were a part of our menu, but sometimes they were our actual main lesson, especially in kindergarten. And I bet a lot of people have super collections in their classroom. And the big part of counting collections is that students have choice in how they do it. They have choice in how they organize their count. Maybe we choose what they count, but they have choice in how to count, how to organize it, what kinds of tools to use. Maybe they're using 10 frames. This is a carton with that's in a 10 frame, although you could have some that were 12s as well, and see, or a dozen, and see how students use those. Students will work with cups, and or here's some 10 frames in action. But the key features are that the students organize how they're going to count, and then they also organize how they're going to represent their count. And it's such an interesting task to observe students in that piece of executive functioning of how they organize their count. So some of the ideas for choral count, or sorry, counting collections with older students are things like, so this is a counting collections activity that I did with some second graders where they were really interested. They happened to hear this administrative assistant say she needed to order some Post-its. And so they wanted to find out how many Post-its were in the supply closet. And it was towards the end of second grade, and some of them were really starting to notice and get interested in multiplication. So this was really fun because we were able to count loose items and then also count things in groups. I will tell you that we did not all agree on the total number of Post-it packets, and that was rather contentious, but it was so much interesting organization and reorganization and discussion about how to count and what to count. And that was really fascinating to watch. It would be a really great 3-act task. Yeah. Something that I love doing with fourth graders is, you know, they would come and work with me, and I had been many of their kindergarten teacher, and so they wanted to go right into the buttons, and I said, yeah, let's count the buttons. Let's see how many buttons are in there, and then I said, all right, now I want you to figure out how many buttonholes. Take a scoop and figure out how many buttonholes. And that was so interesting in how they organized. You know, some kids immediately went to making groups of 10 with the buttonholes. Other kids organized by things with 4 whole buttonholes or 2 buttonholes. Some didn't even really pay attention necessarily to the holes, but organized by shape and color, and then went back and figured out how many holes there were. So there's lots of ways to do counting collections with older students as well that are really interesting insight into what they know and understand about counting, but then also thinking about how things come in groups. All right. And these are just some of the questions that, and some of the thinking that the students in the second grade post had time or had before we started counting. So we have some different things, different options for exploring for the next few minutes. I'm going to give you about 8 minutes to take a look. There's some different videos. This is just a quick little overview of what's in the next few slides. So take, I guess I'm gonna give you about 10 minutes, sorry. Take about 10 minutes and just do a little exploring of your own and thinking about what would you like to try. I'll stay here in the main room. Feel free to leave your camera on or turn your camera off and just take a few minutes to either check out some of the choral counting videos. There's some interesting counting collection videos and some additional resources down here. And so we'll meet back here in about 10 minutes. Well, I hope that you were able to find something in that time there that was helpful. Really, this is just the tip of the iceberg of a conversation about two practices that kids, in my experience, have just adored and benefited in. More importantly, maybe not more importantly, maybe equally as important, have benefited from greatly. From K all the way up to fifth graders. Well, before we go, there's this picture in the slide deck is a link to how you can stay connected with all learners. There's so many wonderful free workshops right now that are being offered, and I think my understanding is that there'll be another round. Is that right, John? There'll be another round in the next semester. Yeah,
there's a bunch
so
coming up, and
such a
hopefully
wonderful
there'll be some
gift.
in the fall as well. Thank you
Great.
so much, Lily. This is wonderful.
Oh, thank you all so much. I really appreciate you hanging in there with me and my nerves. I hope everybody has a good rest of your fall, or at least this part of the semester.